So, the ICSE 2027 Literature Specimen Paper is here. And if you are a Class 10 student, you might already be thinking, should I start solving these questions? Should I memorize these answers? Will similar questions come in the board exam? Let's pause there, because the specimen paper itself gives us a very clear answer about what it is meant for. It says that the specimen provides a realistic format of the board examination question paper and should be used as a practice tool. And then comes the important part, the questions for the board examination can be set from any part of the syllabus. But the format of the board examination question paper will remain the same as the specimen question paper. So today, we are going to use this paper exactly for what it is meant for. Not as a prediction paper, not as a question bank, but as a way to understand the format and direction of the examination. Let's begin with the structure. The paper is for 80 marks. The time allowed for writing the answers is 2 hours. And before you start writing, you get the first 15 minutes only to read the question paper. The paper has 4 sections. Section A is compulsory. That means every question in Section A has to be answered. Then you have to attempt 1 question from Section B, 1 question from Section C, 1 question from Section D, and 1 additional question from any section of your choice. And the marks for questions or parts of questions are given in brackets. So before we even look at a single question, the first thing the specimen gives us is a very clear picture of how the paper is organized. Now I want you to stop here for a moment, because this is probably the most important note in the entire specimen paper. The document tells you that questions for the board examination can be set from any part of the syllabus. But the format of the board examination question paper will remain the same as the specimen question paper. So there are 2 things you need to separate in your mind. The content can come from anywhere in the syllabus, but the format is what this specimen is showing you. And that changes the way we should use this paper. We are not asking, which question should I memorize? We are asking, how is the question being asked? That's the direction we are going to follow throughout this video. Now let's enter Section A. Section A carries 16 marks, and the specimen tells you to attempt all the questions from this section. Question 1 contains 16 multiple choice questions. But look carefully at how these questions are framed. The paper doesn't simply ask you to remember facts. For example, 1 question asks what Antony means by, "Thou bleeding piece of earth." That's marked understanding. Another asks what Brutus means by, "Ambition's debt is paid." Again, understanding. Then there is a question asking what Brutus's behavior towards Cassius shows about him. The skill given there is again understanding. But then you also have questions marked recall, analysis, and application. For example, the question about Lepidus is marked recall. The question about Chinna the poet's death is marked analysis. And the question asking you to identify a figure of speech in another poem that matches the figure of speech in a line from The Power of Music is marked application. So even within Section A, the paper is showing you different kinds of tasks. There's another useful thing you can notice simply by looking at question 1. The 16 questions move across different texts. You have questions from Julius Caesar. You have poetry, haunted houses, The Glove and the Lions, When Great Trees Fall, A Considerable Speck, and The Power of Music. And you also have short stories such as With the Photographer, The Last Lesson, The Pedestrian, The Girl Who Can, and The Elevator. So Section A itself gives you a very broad sample of the syllabus. And that connects directly with the note we just discussed. The board questions can come from any part of the syllabus. So your preparation cannot depend on preparing only the texts that happen to appear in one particular section of this specimen. Now let's move to Section B, Drama. And here, the prescribed drama is Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. The specimen gives us 2 questions. Question 2 uses an extract from Act 3, Scene 2. That's Antony's funeral speech beginning with, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." Question 3 takes us much later, to Act 5, Scene 1, with Brutus and Cassius before the battle. And this immediately gives us something useful about the way we are expected to approach the text. The questions are not all asking for the same kind of answer. Let's look at question 2 carefully. Question 2 is particularly useful because one extract produces 5 different questions. First, the paper asks what Antony says he has come to do and what he says he has not come to do, and then asks what this tells you about him. So you are moving from the words in the extract to an understanding of Antony. Then the paper asks about the conditions Brutus laid down before allowing Antony to speak, and asks why you think Brutus laid down those conditions. Then you have a question asking for two arguments Antony uses to prove Caesar was not ambitious, followed by the impact of those arguments on the Romans. Then comes a personal response. The paper asks, which one argument do you think had the greatest impact? And it specifically asks you to give reasons. And finally, you are asked to explain Antony's lines about the evil men do in the good that is often forgotten, and apply those lines to Brutus and Caesar. So look at the movement. The paper takes you from the extract, to the events, to the characters, to reasoning, to your own supported response, and finally back to the characters and their actions. Now let's look at something extremely encouraging in the draft marking scheme. For question 2, it says that the answers provided are indicative only. And it says that other correct and relevant answers, supported by appropriate reasoning where applicable, should also be accepted. That's important. It means that when the question is asking for a personal response, you don't have to somehow discover one secret sentence that the examiner has hidden. But there is one condition. Your response has to be correct and relevant, and where reasoning is required, your reasoning needs to support your response. We can see this very clearly in question 2, part 4. The marking scheme gives possible choices such as Caesar wept, Caesar refused the crown, the ransoms, Caesar's robe, Caesar's mutilated body, or Caesar's will. And then it says, justifications must match reasons. That is something you should understand very clearly. A personal response is not a random response. You make a choice, and then you support that choice. Question 3 gives us another very useful example. The extract begins with Cassius asking Brutus whether he would be willing to be led through Rome in triumph if they lost the battle. The questions then move through several different areas. You are asked to understand what Brutus means. You are asked to explain the farewell and how it hints at their deaths. You are asked how Brutus dies and how his manner of dying contradicts the philosophy by which he had lived his life. Then you are asked why Antony calls Brutus the noblest Roman of them all, and what that reveals about Antony. And finally, you are asked about the strange occurrence Cassius observed when his army was marching from Sardis to Philippi and what effect that experience had on him. Again, notice the movement. The question isn't staying at one level. It moves through the extract, the character, the later events of the play, the character's philosophy, and the consequences of what happens. Now let's move to section C, prose, or short stories. The specimen gives us question 4 from The Elevator by William Sleater. And question 5 from The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet. Again, let's not just look at the stories. Let's look at what the questions are asking us to do with them. In The Elevator, the first question asks why Martin is afraid of using this particular elevator and what this tells us about him. Then we are asked about the person who enters the elevator and how this person makes Martin feel. Then comes a question about Martin feeling ashamed of himself, and specifically asks how his response was shaped by his father's opinion of him. Then the paper asks how the story ends and asks you to bring out the element of horror in the ending. And finally, you are asked why Martin was nervous when his father got out of the lift on the 9th floor, and then to give 2 words describing the ending. So once again, the paper is not simply asking, do you know the story? It is asking you to use what you know about the story to explain Martin, his feelings, his relationship with his father, and the ending. Now look at the last lesson. The first question asks who M. Hamel was and which character trait as a teacher you find most appealing. Then you are asked about the elderly village folk who were present in the classroom and what feelings you think they experienced. Then the paper asks what felt different to Franz when he arrived late. Then comes Franz's biggest regret about school and asks which aspects of his character you relate to. And the final question combines several tasks. You have to understand what the expression, thunderclap, suggests. You have to use the expression in your own sentence with the same meaning. And then you have to mention one important lesson M. Hamel taught his students and give a reason for your choice. So here again, the question is making you move from remembering, to understanding, to responding, and in some parts, using the idea yourself. Now we come to section D, poetry. The specimen uses 2 poems. The Glove and the Lions by Leigh Hunt, and A Considerable Speck by Robert Frost. And once again, the questions show us that poetry preparation cannot stop at simply knowing the poem's summary. Look at question 6. The first part asks you to describe the scene at the beginning of the poem. Then the next part says, Leigh Hunt uses vivid sound and visual images to describe the contest between the royal beasts in the pit. And the instruction is, justify the statement with close reference to the text. Now look at the draft marking scheme. For visual images, it gives examples such as, laughing jaws, glared, gave blows like beams, and the lions rolling on one another. For sound images, it gives examples such as, lions roared, stifled roar, and thunderous smother. So the direction here is very clear. Don't simply say, there are sound images. Show them. Use the words from the poem to support what you are saying. And then question 6 gives us another kind of response. You are asked to explain what the poet means by smiling lips and sharp bright eyes. And then you are asked, if you had to give the poem a title of your own, what would it be? Give one reason to justify your choice. The draft marking scheme says that any suitable title plus any plausible justification should be accepted. So again, the important thing is not memorizing one title. The important thing is being able to make a suitable choice and support it. Question 7, based on a considerable spec, follows the narrator's experience with the tiny creature. First, what did he imagine the speck to be? Then what was he doing when he spotted it? Then what made him realize that he was dealing with an intelligence? Then what actions of the mite led him to conclude that it had feet? And finally, what was his initial response? What did he eventually decide to do, and why? The draft marking scheme tells us that the narrator initially wanted to stop it with his pen or a drop of ink, but eventually decided to let it lie there. And the suggested reason is respect for intelligent life, among other plausible responses. The final part asks for one word to describe the tone of the poem, with responses such as philosophical, reflective or meditative. Now we've looked at the questions. Let's look at the draft marking scheme. And this is where you get another important piece of information. Across the questions, the marking scheme repeatedly uses phrases like, personal response question. Please accept any plausible response. Any suitable title plus any plausible justification. And in question 2, it says that other correct and relevant answers supported by appropriate reasoning should also be accepted. So when you are preparing, don't think, I need to memorize the exact wording of the marking scheme. Instead, think, I need to understand the text well enough to give a relevant answer and support it when the question asks me to. That is a much more useful way to prepare. So, after going through the entire specimen paper, what direction can we take from it? First, know your text. Because the questions can come from different parts of the syllabus. Second, understand exactly what the question is asking. Look at the wording. Is it asking you to recall, explain, analyze, give a personal response, apply something, justify your answer? And third, build your answer according to that demand. If the question asks you to justify, give support. If it asks for a personal response, make a relevant choice. If it asks you to use an expression in your own sentence, actually use it in the required way. If it asks you to explain a line and apply it to characters, do both parts. The specimen is giving us examples of all of these. And this is the approach I want you to take from today. Don't make your preparation only about asking, what is the answer to this question? Start asking, what is this question asking me to do? Because the specimen contains questions that ask you to recall information. Questions that ask you to understand. Questions that ask you to analyze. Questions that ask you to apply. Questions that ask you to evaluate. And questions that include creativity. Those labels are actually printed beside the questions in the specimen. And this is exactly where we're going next on the channel. We're going to take Julius Caesar and approach it differently. Not just, here is the summary. Not just, here are some important questions. We're going to go through the play step by step and understand what is happening, what the characters are saying, what the important details mean, and then connect that understanding to the way questions can be asked. We'll look carefully at the kind of thinking the specimen is already showing us. And then we'll practice building answers around that. The goal is simple. I want you to become more confident when you see a literature question because you understand what the question is asking you to do. If you follow this series seriously, my aim is that you don't just know more literature. You become better at handling literature questions. And that difference matters. Because knowing the story is one thing. Knowing how to use that understanding when a question is placed in front of you is another. That's the approach we are going to build together. And yes, the aim is to help you score more by preparing with a clearer, more structured approach. So if you are preparing for ICSE 2027 literature, subscribe to the channel. Because this specimen paper is only our starting point. We are going to start with Julius Caesar and take the same approach into the actual text. We'll go step by step. We'll understand the scenes. We'll understand the characters. We'll understand the questions. And most importantly, we'll learn how to turn that understanding into answers. So subscribe to ICSE Decoded and stay with the series. We're going to build this preparation together, and the goal is not just to finish the syllabus. The goal is to understand it well enough to answer with confidence and score more. I'll see you in Julius Caesar.